Good afternoon, everyone, or almost evening, depending on how you're feeling. Hopefully, we can have sort of a discussion and we can kind of get to know each other. You can get to know what I do, what I love, who I am, where I come from, and how I've come to understand history. And we can just, we can like each other to end the day, right? We can all go to dinner together. We'll see. So the title of my presentation is called Black Parade, African American Migration to, from, and to Central New York. A little quick story. I came to understand the process of migration as a very, very little person. My family, both my mother and my father's family, found home in Central New York, specifically Syracuse. So every summer, since I was a small person, we would take this trip always back to South Carolina. And my parents were they're very musical people. My father was very musical in particular. So he would play this song by Gladys Knight and the Pips. And it was Midnight Train to Georgia, right? So picture a 5-year-old person in the back of a car, probably a LeBaron, screaming at the top of their lungs and trying to sing like Gladys Knight, right? My parents were like, what is, can we drop her off? But I was learning migration through that song, both through my action of leaving New York State and going to South Carolina, but I was also learning about migration through song, which is something that I don't think historians and educators lean on enough when we're talking about education. Oftentimes, our discipline is seen as something that's boring, it's antiquated, we gotta read. And you don't always have to do those things just. You can do so much more, and you can understand things so much more. Beyonce gave us this wonderful song called Black Parade in her Black is King album. And it's literally a song talking about migration once again. So not 5-year-old me, right? Like 4-year-old me was, again, building out the lyrics to another song about migration. And what I learned was that this thing about migration, what I came to contend with, and what I came to understand very quickly, is that migration patterns for African American people are not linear. They're very much so circular, right? We go back and forth, back and forth, back and forth. It's not one spot to another. This thing, it happens over a course of time and through a course of space. So we're going to talk about that today. Let's see if the clicker works.
We're going to turn it on side to side. Button there.
Oh, okay, it's got lights.
There you go.
Okay, it's got lights. So imagine if you're teaching K through 12, or even I do this with my university students. I take Jacob Lawrence's The Migration series, and I use all 60 panels. But I don't put any text on them, and I don't put them in order. These people, students, they like to write their own captions, they like to do their own things, so I encourage them to do those things. I want them to tell me the story of migration using images, using art, but I want them to create the captions for themselves so they understand it, and I want them to put them in order, all 60, in a way that they can understand it, right? This is usually a homework assignment, which most of them actually have really liked over the past 15 years that I've been doing this. I haven't met one that's like, I haven't met one yet. I'm pretty sure there's some grumblers. But this particular, this is number 3. And number 3, the caption for this one is, from every southern town, migrants left by the hundreds to travel north. What I want us to do is I want us to disrupt how we understand African American migration. I want us to disrupt the time, because usually it's bookshelved, right? Starting at 1910, and then we go up to 1970, and it's like it stops. That's not true. If we're thinking about migration of African American people, well, we have to think about African American people and Black people in this country for the whole time that they've been here. Then you have to consider some things. You have to consider what is constituted as the South. You have to consider, and that's a whole other conversation for a whole day, right? But you have to contend with what spaces we're talking about. You have to contend with what freedom looks like to different people. And then you have to contend with how we understand our bookshelves our bookmarks of time, this revolutionary period to a contemporary period. Well, what about before the revolution, right? What about before the revolution? Our goal with this is to understand that time needs to expand past, if I'm being generous, right? I feel like being generous today. But we'll start in the 17th century, right? And if we're being even more so generous, we'll look all the way up until the 21st century. So all of that time, migration is happening. All of that time, African American people are requiring and demanding that the U.S. hold true to its principles and its values. We have to think about how we expand, how we talk about migrants. We have to think about what we have in the archives, archival repositories, and then we have to think about what's housed in domestic repositories, and how does that shape the narrative. So expanding the story to include people, and not just as this contextualized thing where we talk about how migration patterns of African American people changed the U.S., but how did it change their lives? How did it change their families? How does it give hope? I am the child and grandchild of migrants, and I raise all kinds of hell, but in a good way, depending on who you ask it. As we're doing this work, a couple of questions that we have to consider. One, we have to figure out how we've learned and how we've taught the story of African American migration. We have to contend with what is the accepted narrative of African American migration and what do we not know just yet. And that last part of that question is kind of hard to nail down. The second part is we have to contend with who the migrants have been. Again, going back to that accepted narrative. There is a picture that people get in their head when they think of migrants, and it's usually that picture from panel 3, where you see people coming with bags, and you see people downtrodden, and you see people who are trying to escape this something. Painting this picture that all kinds of migrants, or that all migrants, were running from something bad and going to something good. Well, while one part of that piece may be true, the bad, we have to remember that sometimes the thing that they went to wasn't always good. And we have to have real conversations about those kinds of things. The third is, when did African American migration begin? Well, I think people who liberate themselves from the institution of slavery are migrants, right? I'm just going to go ahead and say it, right? I think that they're migrants. I don't care how we look at that. I don't care who I'm talking to. I think that they're migrants. They're leaving, right? If we're talking about push and pull, that's a hell of a push, right? Freedom is definitely a pull. So we have to consider it. And we have to consider how we understand self-emancipated people. The fourth, where did African American migrants come from and where did they go? We'll get to New York State in just a moment, but it's not always rural country spaces that people come from, right? Sometimes people came from urban spaces as they developed over the course of time to more northern urban spaces. So if we're talking about Memphis, right? People from Memphis sometimes end up in Chicago. Sometimes people in Washington, D.C., they end up in New York City. Sometimes people in, Richmond, Virginia, they end up in Philadelphia and then New York City and then Boston, right? Say Boston how you want to, it's fine. Nobody's gonna judge you. Questioning, why did they leave the space they were born, and did they ever return? So that cyclical migration that I'm talking about. Consider the fact that migration is a sacrifice. Some people did not return back to their home spaces, and they severed the ties of the people that had raised them, reared them, and loved them, literally walking into the unknown. Consider that as you also consider visiting, going back, taking children back, learning, teaching the ways of home. There are things that traveled with them on their journey to different spaces that you don't necessarily see or understand, but they're in you. And we're talking about song, we're talking about foodways, we're talking about all kinds of culture that travel with you. So just because you leave a space, that doesn't mean that the things that you left behind necessarily, you never see them again. It's just hard to hold on, hard to teach certain aspects and, I guess, cultural things when you are so far removed from the space of home. But you need to consider that home is wherever people go and wherever people make it. Lastly, who are the descendants of migrants? Where do they live? What do they know? And what has been lost? Well, if you're talking to me, right, I'm the descendants of migrants. I live in Syracuse, New York. I know a lot, but I know a lot because I've listened. I know a lot because I returned. I know a lot because I refuse to let those ways of home necessarily die. I'm very intentional about keeping certain things about my culture, my heritage, and my family very much so alive. In order to attain a PhD, I had to take a language exam, right? I'm an Americanist. I had to take a language exam. So I had to be creative in what language I was going to do. I wasn't going to do Spanish. I wasn't going to do Russian. I wasn't going to do German. To which my history department was like, what? Ma'am, who are you? Jessica, I'm the granddaughter of Blessed Terry Sr. My grandfather speaks Gullah Geechee very well. You hear him talking, sir, you said what? So I had to be creative. And I had to go find an Africana language department at Yale University and find a professor who taught Gullah Geechee, and I took my test in Gullah Geechee because I refused to lose it. And I refused to let anybody tell me that that is not valuable to the story of migrants, to the story of their descendants. Pre-revolution migration in Syracuse, New York is very, very shaky. I say shaky because I'm going to talk about salt. Salt is what builds Central New York. Salt is the thing that Central New York produces in mass for a very long time. It is what helps to make Central New York one of the top 30 cities in the country up till around about 1930, right? So top Syracuse, New York, top 30 cities in the country. Who? It was us. But it was from the production of salt. What's interesting when you go to the Salt Museum is that there is no mention of the two black men who were self-emancipated from Espas. Nowhere in the record. Nowhere in the record. You get this information from Silas Broker as the senator from Katy County. He mentions this in a journal. And from that journal, you know that you have to do some backtracking. So now I had to go, and I had to go to the archive, and I had to go find these wanted ads for these two men who leave this space. Two migrants who come to Syracuse, find themselves in the salt industry. Migration looks very different when you start to talk about it in varying ways. It's not just one note. It's not about just the pathway from southern spaces to northern spaces. This one happens just in New York State. This is that migration from down in the southern tier up to central New York. It's something to consider looking at just one state and how one state understands its own migration. If we were to think about the land of free blacks in Manhattan, well, when that land is lost to them, well, where do they go? They migrate someplace else. You have to consider those things as well. If we're just going to talk about New York State. And I like talking about New York State because we live here, right? I don't like talking about other spaces. Contending with life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness as we move to the 19th century to our 19th century understanding of Black migration, I think we have to think pre and post Civil War, right? So self-liberation is a thing. Participating in the war effort is a thing. Colonization is a thing. But I think, just for a moment, I want you to consider how colonization is someone else telling another group of people what their home should be, or what their home could be, and the pushback, as if the blood of themselves and the blood of their ancestors does not build this land. How come you get to have my home, the home that I built, and I don't get to have the home that I built? That is my home, you're absolutely right. But I don't know that home, and you don't get to make that determination for me. But some do leave in the colonization effort, and some do return. And we have to consider that as migration as well. The only thing that I want you to gather from this is that migration is a web of so many different things and so much understanding that I need us all to pay attention to. It is after well, I'll answer that. Okay. It is after this moment of 1868 where we have African American people truly having an understanding of what citizenship is. They put the 14th Amendment front and center. If we're going to say that citizenship is something that all people feel, that we're all people. So we're going to make sure that we have access to that citizenship as well. We're going to make sure that we push this thing as far as it can go, even if we have to leave the spaces of our home and go someplace that we don't know. We have to endure the customs that we don't know. We have to understand the space. We have to understand the weather in a space that we don't know. Citizenship is just that important. And we have to think about migrants as people who are wanting, needing, and demanding that citizenship be actualized on their bodies and in their lives. This is the part of citizenship, this is the part of migration that most people are comfortable with. This is the first panel from Jacob Lawrence's The Migration series, and this is the first panel out of 60. Ready? One more time. The first panel out of 60, the first one. And this does the work to place migration at the start of World War I. And I just gave you a whole swath of examples of how migration does not start at this moment, but it starts prior to. I'm going to just say this. I think it's wise to say that there's an uptick in migration, right? Just a small uptick, just a little bit. It's so interesting to introduce students when we're talking about this to railroad lines, right? If we're talking about the railroad, it runs in very specific directions. It's not really going to change, right? And having students kind of chart where people come from and where they go and watch them make their own inferences about how migration patterns happen. If we're talking about the southern parts of the U.S., Georgia and South Carolina, well, that's the eastern seaboard. So that's why you get Philadelphia, that's why you get Washington, D.C., that's why you get New York City, and that's why you get Boston. If we're talking about Mississippi, that's why you get Cleveland. That's why you get Chicago. When we're talking about Louisiana and Texas, Louisiana is the one where we could go, we could do this thing either way, right? Depending on what time the train came. Either we're gonna go Chicago if we're in Louisiana, we're going west. West doesn't open up until World War II. When the industry, again, that pull factor to get people to, there's wartime efforts over there. Highway 66 is kind of revving up, but the train is still there. So Louisiana, we can go west, but most Texans, they definitely go west. And that's how you get Oakland. That's how you get San Francisco. That's how you get Los Angeles. There's a very small, tiny pocket in Oregon, but it exists. But I think people were like, listen, we're just gonna stop. Okay, we're not gonna go any further. But there's a very small pocket in Oregon as well. But the train tracks are kind of what you can use to show young people and us how migration patterns work in this country for African American people. Syracuse is both sweet and salty. Hear me out. It's sweet because of the chocolate people that come. It's salty because of the salt. You see how we did that? I have a very good friend named Zara Robinson. She's a professor at Rose College. We laugh because we talk about chocolate cities all the time. And if you are, I ain't even old enough to say this, but I pretend like I'm old enough to say this, but if you know who Parliament is, George Clinton, P-Funk. Okay. There's a song, right, called Chocolate Cities. And I think she and I were born, like, in the wrong era. Maybe for the right reasons, though, right? But we kind of gravitated to that song, and she produced this book called Chocolate Cities. And I asked her, I said, well, can Syracuse be called the Chocolate City? She said, absolutely not. There's not enough black people in Syracuse to be called the Chocolate City. I'm sorry, that's not how your numbers work. I was like, yeah. I know I didn't like the statistics, but damn. But we talked about it, and what I kind of gathered was that we have chocolate spaces in the city of Syracuse. Southside is the blackest space in Syracuse, right? And most people never come to Syracuse, so when you do visit, you never notice how that city is divided. It is definitely racially divided, with black people living on the south side and Latinx people living on a different side of town, and then everyone who is considered white living on another side of town. It is literally racially divided, right? So thinking about how Syracuse operates, or how Syracuse has grown as a chocolate space, we have to consider how black people got here. In doing that, we visit the archives. As we visit archival repositories, there are collections that exist that shouldn't be in certain spaces. One example of that is the Prudence Wayland Smith papers that exist at Syracuse University Special Collections Research Center. I lied to you not, hand to God, I had no idea who this lady was. I have no idea why this collection was pulled for this workshop event. But one of my colleagues opened the box and she pulled out a folder, and it was a collection of photos of just various black people. And she was like, Jessica, here. I was like, wait, you don't want to look at these? Why? She was like, no, it's not like that. I was like, oh, I was just checking, right? She puts it in front of me, and I open the folder, and I start to cry because I know what I'm looking at, but I don't know who I'm looking at, but I know what I'm looking at. So I put that folder back in the box, and I open the next folder that has a bunch of letters in it. And my eyes start to sweat again. I gotta stop saying I cry. I say my eyes sweat. Just the same thing, but I gotta be tough some kind of way, whatever. I look in this folder, and these are beautiful handwritten letters to people thanking this woman for an opportunity to come from Sanford, Florida. And I freak out because my mom is from Sanford, Florida. And all of a sudden, I literally have goosebumps right now. All of a sudden, I said to myself, I was like, oh my God, my mom could be in this box. And she doesn't even know it. And I asked the archivist, how long has this box been here? She told me it was donated in the 1980s and it's just been collecting dust, but it was one that had different formats of archives. There was pictures in it, it was letters in it, there was all kinds of things in it, and she just brought it out. I was like, it don't work like that. It doesn't work like that. So he brought this out for a reason. So in my research, and as I've been talking about migration, I've also started to talk about photography. And I've started to understand migration even more in this journey through that manuscript collection. But I had questions. I had questions about why hadn't these archival repositories kind of publicized any of their holdings that deal with migration, African American migration, from and to Syracuse. Is that just not a part of the story of Syracuse? How does that work? So I pushed. I realized very quickly that the accepted narrative that exists around migration is largely housed within archival repositories, but it reinforces certain narratives. It reinforces who, it reinforces why, and it reinforces how migrants came to Syracuse. So me being me, and we're all friends, so you already know I'm definitely going to be a part of the nonsense that happens when we choose to disrupt certain things. I had a question. And the only person that could answer this question was my grandmother. This lady's a curator by her own right. No professional title needed. I asked, how did you guys come to Syracuse? Because I need to know. I'll be done. I asked her, how did you guys come to Syracuse? What I found, okay, I heard you. You're welcome. I asked her, how did you guys come to Syracuse? And my grandmother gave me a very not so nice answer, because we needed to. Because she was over me, right? She's always over me, but that's not the point of this story. It wasn't until my grandfather passed that she became a little bit more gentle with me. And what I mean by that is she allowed me access to her archives. And the archives that this lady has under her bed, and there's a reason why they are under her bed, it's for protection. It is the fear of loss. It is her trying to protect not only her family, but it's her trying to protect herself. This thing is personal for her. That's why it's up under something so personal as a bed. But all of a sudden, after my grandfather passed, we all gathered at his house and we watched this Super 8 film. And I was floored. Because in this domestic repository, laid a counter narrative to how we understand migration. It's something different, because they are not downtrodden people who are carrying just their stuff with them on their back. No, my grandfather was driving a boat that he owned. Sir, where you get this money from? It's not my business. Thank you. Thank you. Right? It showed me my grandmother, it showed me my father, it showed me my uncles traveling to New York, and then it showed me them back home in South Carolina. It showed me this whole thing with people who I loved my whole life, but it showed me them before they were in service to me, before I was here. So all of a sudden, I got to humanize migrants, not as my parents, not as my grandparents, nothing, but as themselves. That story is very different than what exists in the archival repositories. So the story of migration, you have two things to do. You have to elongate the time, You have to expand how you understand it. And if you expand how you understand it by looking in two separate places, you get a very human story of both love and sacrifice. Thank you. Q&A? Questions, comments, smart remarks, anything?
So why did your family move, or what was one of the reasons that your family found its way to Syracuse?
So my father's side of the family found their way to Syracuse through my Aunt Hazel, which is my grandfather's sister. She wanted something different. She wanted to work. She wanted to be in a city. How she found Syracuse, that is something that I still have to do research on, but I know it's her who brings the rest of her family. My mother's side of the family is very different. Again, my mother's side of the family, they were agricultural workers. So they got on a bus traveling from Sanford, Florida, Florida to Syracuse. That's a long trip, right? And we got highways now. What? It's a very long trip. But some of them, after the season would end, they would just stay. My mother didn't stay. She came up here. She came to Syracuse in probably 1963, but then she went back home, and she wouldn't return until about maybe 1972. And when she got here in 72, she stayed. She's been there ever since. My father's a character. He came up, went down, went back home, came up, went back down, enlisted in the army, lied about his age, and didn't tell anybody his age until he married my mother. And they got the marriage certificate, and he was like, wait, I gotta tell you something. My mother was like, what? He was like, I'm not really how old I say I am. And he actually wrestled with that until he passed. But he came up here just going back and forth, and then he would find his space here once he was ready for high school. He just committed to being here and made his life here. Migration's my jam.
There was an exhibition that was done in Utica quite a few years ago called On the Season, and it was about Florida migrant workers who moved, and they didn't just come directly. They moved with with strawberries and then the beans and then all the way up. And that sounds exactly like the story that you're telling.
And what's interesting is that though I work with an elderly population right now on a photo project in Syracuse, and I just mentioned migration, and then all of the sudden, they asked me, where are you from? I'm like, okay, hold on, because I know what you're asking me. Like, I'm from South Carolina, but I'm also from Florida, because that's what they're asking me. They're not asking me about me. They could care less, right? I'm just the vehicle. And then all of a sudden there are conversations about, oh my God, I'm from, and I'm like, how did you all get here? And so many people give me one name. This guy's name is Hot Sauce.
Hot Sauce?
Hot Sauce. I have no idea who this man is, but he would be the person to put together the various crews who would drive up from Florida. So I've been on a mission to find Hot Sauce for at least the past 7 years. It's fine. I'm gonna find him. You can't hide. I'm gonna find him. I'm not worried about it. I'm gonna find him.
Have you ever looked at some of the temporary communities that popped up around Syracuse in the Florence community?
Yes. So there are lots of, in those papers, in the Prudence Wayland Smith papers, she's kind of like my launching pad into looking into other small pockets of communities and just trying to understand how they receive migrant populations and then where do they go after.
Yeah, because most of them don't stay very long. You've got Timbuktu, which is way up north. They're only given poor quality land and it doesn't work.
So it's a mixture of not only just the pork, but thinking about the social environment that exists.
The last name of the photographer again? the person you keep saying that took the photo?
Oh, Prudence Wayland Smith.
So Waylon Smith is probably somebody tied to the United Community.
She has that part, and she has this whole network of like migrant reform agencies, which is it's a dirty thing when you start looking into it, because you're like, wait, but you can't put contemporary ideas. But that piece about the creation of these little communities and then their disappearance, you speaking my language. See, I knew I was in a room with the people I like. So thank you guys for coming. Liz?
I'm just inspired by this whole presentation and thinking more about migration. I want to look up those images, the panel series, looking at that. So I'm just so happy that I got to end by your amazing presentation.
Thank you.
So much.